for joining us today for what we think is an incredibly relevant and timely conversation. And my name is Bill Wilson. I'm the former director of the Center for Healthy Churches. Still work with them on occasion, like about 25 hours a day, but glad to have had a season of transition in terms of a sort of a planned succession model, which one day we're going to do a whole webinar on that, what we're learning about succession planning for not just mega churches, but for all churches. How do you do that in a healthy way? But Matt has taken over as the director, and grateful for that. He's on his way actually to North Carolina today, so he can't be with us on the call. But our webinar has been, I think, a bright light in a kind of foggy, dismal season of life for many clergy and churches. And it's the product of a joint effort. I'm going to read down the list of our partners in this. We say that every week because we want to recognize this is not something we do in a silo or on our own. This is something we do in collaboration with others, which another lesson from the pandemic. A New Matrix, the Church Network, Gardner-Webb Divinity School, the Presbyterian Foundation, Truett Seminary, Truett Church Network, Baptist News Global, and the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving. And several people on the call today are related to those entities. But together we've been able to pull together, I think, some pretty interesting, stimulating, and helpful material. And we're in the midst of a series of conversations right now around the notion of putting your foot on the gas when your tank is empty. Or as I first heard this metaphor, Stephen Covey used to say, have you ever been too busy driving to stop for gas? And everybody in the room would nod their head. And his response was, all right, how did that work out for you? And we all, I hope, have only had one or two times where we were out of gas on the side of a road and begging for help. Sadly, for many clergy, that's a pretty consistent pattern. And not just clergy, but for laity. And what we're hearing is one of the reasons we're having this conversation is that one of the impacts of the pandemic in ways that we didn't fully anticipate was a reckoning, if you will, about time and energy and passion. I don't know if you all seen the article, How COVID Stole Our Time and How We Get It Back. It was in the Atlantic, New York Times, maybe a few months ago. I'll try to put the link to that. It was a life-changing article for me. And I would commend it to you. And by the way, last week, Ayana mentioned a book, 4,000 Weeks. I bought it. I've been reading it. And I wish she hadn't mentioned it because it's one of those books that you can't stop reading and going, I need to go back and read that page again. And today, Greg Rogers is our guest, who has his own journey through some of the challenges we're talking about. Greg, for 300 years was pastor at Oakmont Baptist Church in Greenville, North Carolina. Actually, was it 30? He was on staff and pastoring for 35, 36 years?
38 years and 35.
38. I'll see your 36 and raise you to 38.
Yeah, there you go.
So one of the most long tenured ministers we know, and also one of the most effective and one of the most thoughtful and one of the people that I think models much of what we would say healthy leadership looks like. So Greg, I'm going to let you take it and run with it. We're going to ask questions down the way. If you have questions for Greg, please use the chat feature and drop them in there, and we'll go with that. So Greg, welcome, and tell us whatever you want to tell us about yourself and about the topic we're concerned with.
Well, Bill, thanks for the kind and gracious introduction. And one of the things that Bill did not tell you that kind of connects into what we'll talk about today is Bill was highly instrumental in my going to Wake Forest Baptist Church in Wake Forest, North Carolina, right outside of Raleigh, as the interim senior pastor following the retirement of a long tenured 17-year senior pastor. and also serving as the transition coach through the Center for Healthy Churches. So Bill, thank you again for all of the mentoring and guiding and advice giving experience that you've shared with me. That church sits on the edge of the campus of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, that's where I attended and graduated with 2 degrees. But prior to that time, it was the home, beginning in 1835, of Wake Forest College. And the college eventually, in 1956, moved to its present home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And it was the place where it eventually became Wake Forest University. But I have a story to begin with that involves Wake Forest Baptist Church and Wake Forest University. I've been sharing my spiritual journey with Wake Forest Baptist Church, trying to connect in my story with a biblical text and inviting them to think about their story. And it's been a good way for them to get to know me and for me to share some of my spiritual journeys. And I think I've probably had more failure than I've had success at times, but I think you learn more from your failures than maybe you do your successes. And so I had a chance within the last couple of Sundays, and I felt it was kind of providential when Matt Cook reached out to me about sharing something about my story. That's what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks on the spiritual formation piece with the Wake Forest Baptist Church congregation. And interestingly, Wake Forest Baptist Church was formed in 1835 by 16 students. And the first pastor was the president of Wake Forest College. And that continued to be the case for the next 50 years. So kind of an interesting connection there. So here's my story. It's 2001, and I'm seated in Wake Chapel on the campus of Wake Forest University. And there are 900 freshmen in Wake Chapel and parents. And our freshman son, Philip, is starting his journey at Wake Forest University. And Dr. Thomas K. Hearn, Jr. is the president of Wake Forest College, and he's addressing 900 freshmen and parents. And he tells the story of a former president of Wake Forest College that, again, was on the campus next door at the time to the church where I'm now serving as interim pastor. Dr. William Lewis Petit. He was the president from 1905 to 1927. Apparently, there had been an incident on campus, and a young man had been involved, and a mother writes Dr. William Lewis Petit complaining about the treatment of her son. She thinks that her son has been made a fool of by the college, and she's not a happy camper at all. So she writes Dr. Petit, and she's complaining and upset. And so Dr. Petit writes a letter back to her. And according to Dr. Hearn, now I'm hearing this story in 2001, according to Dr. Hearn, the president at the time at Wake Forest, this is what Dr. Petit writes back to the mother in part. He says, the college had not nor never would ever make a fool out of anyone, but merely sought to bring out of the boy what was already there in the first place. Now, I'm not sure I would have the courage to say that back, write that back to a mama bear who's not too happy about her son with his maltreatment. But it did get me to thinking at the time and, reflecting on my own journey that, whatever we grow in the garden of our lives is going to sprout up one way or the other, either good or bad. And it's going to take over, it's going to surface, it's going to choke out other things. And it made me think about what had been missing in the first place in my own spiritual life. You talk about putting your foot on the gas and moving forward when your tank was empty. I realized in my late 30s and early 40s, about 25 years ago, that my tank was spiritually empty. And sadly, I didn't pay attention to my spiritual formation as a pastor. I don't know what happened. I don't know whether it was in Sunday school, Royal Ambassadors, the youth ministry, the college ministry, in college, going through college, seminary education. Either no one told me, or more than likely, I just didn't pay attention to what was missing in the first place in my spiritual formation. And like a lot of you, I became a Christian as a child, grew up in the church, did all of those things that we're taught to do. I grew up Baptist in the Baptist world. But what really brought it all home to me was 1992. I'd been pastor at Oakmont for about 6 years at that time, and I saw that the Alban Institute was offering a 2-day seminar led by Roy Oswald entitled Managing Your Church Successfully. I'd been a pastor for 6 years. I said, I want to manage my church successfully. And I got to Richmond, Virginia for that 2-day event, and Roy Oswald turned the table on me. He very quickly told us that managing your church successfully means managing yourself successfully. And he had us do an experiment, I think the very first day. He pointed to the 4 corners of the room. He said, the physical corner's over here, the emotional corner, the intellectual corner, back over here is the spiritual corner. Go to the corner of the room that represents your greatest strength. And so I just lost about 25 pounds and then started exercising, was taking good care of myself. And, with a lot of pride, I went over to the physical corner. And he said, now share with everyone some of the practices you're doing that are making you feel well and healthy and successful. And so we all did that. And then Roy Oswald turned the tables on me again. He said, now go to the corner of the room where you're not doing so well, where you need to work on yourself and your self-care. And kind of with my head hung in shame, I walked over to the spiritual side of the room. And that was my first inkling, getting in touch a little bit, that I was not taking good care of myself spiritually. And I feel almost ashamed and embarrassed to have to admit that, because here I was a pastor. I mean, pastors should know better, right? But I was still hard-headed enough that it took 5 more years. 1997, I went to an upper room academy for spiritual formation at Caraway Conference Center in Asheboro, a great week-long event. And it was in that week of spending time in silence and solitude and small group sharing and worship that I began to realize that I was praying as a pastor in worship, in the hospital room, in a member's home, but I was not praying for me. I didn't have that conversational relationship with God. I was studying the Bible for the next sermon or the next Bible study, but I was not letting the Bible read me. I was reading the Bible for information, but I was not reading it for formation. And I realized I was running low on fumes. I had some major holes in my boat, and I kind of felt like I was sinking. And that began a journey for me of starting to practice those spiritual disciplines. And I sit back now and I think, how in the world did I miss all of those biblical passages that talk about sanctification, maturing, growing in your faith, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, grow, mature, be transformed. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. How did I miss out on those practices, those disciplines that fill your tank spiritually, not only of worship and Bible study and meditation, but of silence and solitude and regularly pulling away for retreat and, renewing yourself. And I realized that it just seemed that the church spent so much time getting people connected to Jesus and baptized and serving, but we didn't teach them how to grow, how to grow out of spiritual infancy into spiritual adulthood. And I realized that no organization ever rises above the level of its leadership. And I couldn't lead my congregation to grow spiritually if I was not doing it myself. Well, one of my favorite writers in the spiritual life is Evelyn Underhill. She was a writer in England in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. And in her little book called Disciplines for the Religious Worker, I want you to hear what she wrote. She said, what you are like and what your relation to God is like, this must and will affect all of those whom you visit, preach to, pray with, and to whom you give the sacraments. How are you going to show those souls whom need it so dreadfully, the joy and delightfulness of God and surrender to God, unless you have it yourself. And I realized I went through a significant portion of my early ministry where I didn't have it myself. I was not filling my tank and taking good care of myself spiritually. And so, I started doing some of those practices and habits of the spiritual life. And just real quickly, I just wanted to kind of share and name some of the things that I've been doing that have been meaningful to me. And, everybody's different. And so what works for one person doesn't work for another. And I really am kind of eclectic. I like a lot of different things, not just one thing. So one of the things that I really have appreciated is having those daily planned and even unplanned times alone with God. And it's kind of interesting. My church at Oakmont, when I retired back in January of this year, they gave me a parting gift of an Apple Watch. And if you have an Apple Watch, and I'd never had one before, that twice a day, the little word mindfulness comes up on the Apple Watch. And you can do some exercises to reflect and to think. So, we know that Jesus practiced time alone with God in prayer and study and meditation and silence and solitude. So what I've been telling the Wake Forest folks is, even if you don't believe Jesus, believe Apple, mindfulness on the Apple Watch, if you're plugged into that. I think some daily planned time is really important, and it has been for me. And I told our folks at Wake Forest Baptist Church, I think you need a time and a place and a program. Some people are early morning risers. Some people don't even get awake until lunchtime. Some people are night owls. It doesn't matter the time, find a time. You need a place. It might be on your sunroom, your screened-in porch, outdoors, a special chair in a special room. It could be in the car as you arrive at work. It could be even at your work setting if you get there early enough and you're not disturbed. You need a time, you need a place, and I think you need a program. One of the resources I've used through the years is put out by the Upper Room. Some of you may have seen this before. It's called A Guide to Prayer for All God's People. It's based on the liturgical year. Every day of the week, you get the same opening prayer invocation. You get the same psalm that you read throughout the week. Then you get different scripture passages for each day. You're invited to journal or to just sit and reflect or pray. It has great readings in here from some of the spiritual writers down through the centuries. And then it has a hymn for the week and a closing benediction. They have, I think, 3 or 4 of these. They have another one, it's in the blue cover, called A Guide to Prayer for Ministers and Other Servants. And I've used these 3 books regularly. You can go on the Upper Room website and find it. There's another great devotional resource called Disciplines for the Inner Life. Disciplines for the Inner Life. And it's topical, goes 52 topics based on some of the spiritual disciplines. And it's got the same format of prayer, readings, benediction, psalms, all that. So I found to have a time and a place and a program is really helpful for me. Another thing that's really been helpful to me is to go on retreat, whether it's 2 or 3 hours in the morning. And I think it's possible to take your favorite activity, whether it's golf or gardening or walking or jogging or biking, and intentionally use that activity to invite the presence of God in your life, to fill your tank. And I've done those type of retreats. I've taken weekend and week-long retreats. I've really enjoyed going to some Catholic monasteries. I've gone up to Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker retreat center right outside of Philadelphia. I've found it takes 48 hours for the mind to slow down, the distractions to be set aside, to really enter into a time of silence and solitude and being able to really listen to God. So I'll have to say the Catholics and the Quakers have been tremendous teachers, as well as the United Methodists and the Upper Room. And Glenn Henson, who formerly taught at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and at Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond, he did 3 spirituality retreats at our church. We did those retreats over 20 years. And I know the Quakers and the Catholics were tremendous influences in his life. And that made a big difference in his introducing some of those writers and practices to me. The last thing I'd just say real quickly is if you're going to take care of yourself spiritually, expect interruptions. Just expect interruptions. Just expect the doorbell to ring, the phone ring, the children have some emergency. Church members will come and need something, and they will try to engage themselves on your agenda and knock God off the calendar. And if you examine the life of Jesus, whenever he tried to find time alone out in the desert or wherever, people came running, didn't they? All with legitimate needs. But Jesus couldn't have given them what they needed if he had not spent that time in prayer and silence and solitude. I like a Dallas Willard quote. He was a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California, spiritual writer, ordained Baptist minister. Willard wrote in his 3rd book, The Divine Conspiracy, "It was an important day in my life when at last I understood that if Jesus needed 40 days in the wilderness, I very likely could use 3 or 4. So I would invite you to find 3 or 4 days in the wilderness and remember what someone has said. If we do not come apart, we will come apart. And I think a lot of us, especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic, emotionally, physically, and certainly spiritually, our tanks were empty and we felt like we were coming apart. So Bill, those are some things that I wanted to share.
Great.
And
Thank you.
I'm open to a little bit of dialogue.
Right. Thank you. So if you have thoughts or comments or suggestions of things that we can talk about here, please use the chat feature to do that. Greg, I'm curious, one of the things that I always found as a pastor was I would learn this as a minister and try to practice it and realize that the people in other vocations had just as much of a struggle with these issues as we do. Parents, teachers, my wife's a teacher, and I'd watch teachers just get exhausted by the job.
Yes.
And run out of fuel. So I'm curious how, as a pastor, from the pulpit and in other ways, how did you cook into what you said and what you did as a church to encourage mindfulness or intentionality, if you will, about spirituality?
Well, I think a couple of things, and that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. For instance, we would take one Sunday a month and we would call it a Sabbath Sunday, and we would intentionally not plan any Sunday afternoon or evening activities. We Baptists have always measured our spirituality on how fast and furious we can run them on Wednesday night and all day Sunday. And you remember, Bill, the old 6-point record system. Present, Bible read, Sunday morning, and all these things you check off. And so we would take a Sunday where we would just practice Sabbath and say, just come to worship and go home. And I would often say at the end of the worship service, go home and take a nap. One of the most spiritual things you can do is to go home and take a nap, because if your body is not rested and your mind isn't rested, how can God speak to you? He can't speak to a tired mind and body. So we would take, Sabbath Sundays. One year, I preached for the entire year on that book, Disciplines for the Inner Life. And I invited the congregation to purchase the book, to read through it every week, to let that be their devotional moment throughout the week. And then I would preach on that spiritual discipline on Sunday morning. And we would sometimes, incorporate that hymn, use the prayer that they had been praying. That was another way. When I went to the Academy for Spiritual Formation at Caraway in 1997, I came back from that event distinctly, and that's another story, but briefly, I didn't hear an audible voice, but I distinctly heard God say to me, just as you have needed a week like this for yourself, so your people need something like this. And I went back and shared with our church staff and deacons and other leaders what I had experienced, and that got translated into 20 years of doing a weekend spirituality retreat with our church. And over 400 different people, and some would go over and over and over again, and some only went one time, but I think we had over 400 different people that went to one of those 20 spirituality retreats. And I think that made a big difference. So those are a couple of things that, come to my mind, that I was able to share my own spiritual journey and help to weave it into the fabric of the congregational life.
I had a similar kind of experience, and we started Day Away. We called it, once a month, like the last Thursday of each month, whatever. We just said from 9 to 3, we're going to provide transportation and you bring your own lunch, but we're going to go somewhere. No program, no agenda other than you spend time alone or take a nap. And so we eventually had people taking, days off from work to come, be back, when the kids are out of school, whatever, and say, this is the only time that I actually am in a quiet place. And how much, now we couldn't get most people to go. They were too busy. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, over those 20 years, those literally hundreds of people who are at least introduced to the practices of spiritual formation and solitude, what that did for the fabric of the congregation and those marriages and job performance, everything else. It'd be an interesting thing to go back and we don't really have a way of measuring that, do we? But
well, and Bill, another thing we did in many churches, we were not unique in this, but we offered 7 to 8, sometimes 9 or 10 different spiritual formation small groups on Wednesday evening, and would have a couple hundred people to participate in that. I just think over the course of time, you see the fruit of investing in people's lives spiritually as important decisions are having to be made in the life of the church. And you hear someone in a business meeting or in a deacon's discussion or a Sunday school leadership group or whatever, they'll reference something they've read, by one of the spiritual writers that is influencing their sense of what God is doing. But, I've learned you can't give someone an answer who has not asked the question. You can't push a rope. You can't make someone want to take care of their spiritual life. And there were times as a pastor when I felt like I probably cared more about someone's spiritual life than that person did. And that was frustrating, that I cared more about whether they were growing than they cared.
Right. Somebody asked the 4 corners that Oswald used in the room: spiritual, physical.
It was a physical, emotional, the intellectual, the growth of the mind, and then the spiritual corner. Yeah.
Someone else has said, ask about, this is important information, not just for the pastor, but for the staff. Yes. And that many of these events and resources are available for laity. And Becca Wiggs has talked about that she's going on one of the Academy weekend retreats soon. So as a staff, I'm kind of want to dig into that one for a moment. How do you cultivate a culture among your paid staff, certainly, and even your lay leaders, that values this kind of sensitivity to time and weariness, if you will, and overwork, overfunctioning, and busyness, and all the things that tend to be the enemy of the better part of us?
Well, I know from my end, number one, when we had these weekend spirituality retreats, we would take about half of our staff with us. There were some who were kind of built in, who led music or who were part of the planning, but we invited all of our staff to attend those spirituality retreats. And I would, constantly say to them, hey, I want you to take your vacation time away. I want you to have time away just for spiritual renewal. And I encourage them to go to the retreat centers, to go to the monastery, to take I tried to call it, Bill, not a day off, but a Sabbath day off. And I would often say, to our lay people, Friday is my Sabbath day off, to get them to thinking that Sunday is not Sabbath. If you're employed by a church as a minister, Sunday's a work day. It's one of the busiest work days. So, I just think that creating that permission-giving culture to the staff, and not just the pastor, but encouraging the lay leaders who relate to those staff to be able to applaud them when they take good care of themselves.
One of the things that toward the end of your ministry, this phone became required equipment for all of us.
Yeah.
And you all probably remember when cell phones became widespread, that the notion was going to save us time. I remember a lay person coming to me one day saying, I'm in Maui on my long-awaited vacation, and I got a BlackBerry, and Shaw Carpet is demanding that I send in reports that afternoon, kind of thing. And clergy, to me, feel like some of the worst offenders when it comes to 24/7 availability. And I plead guilty, by the way.
Yeah.
Granted, we're not digital natives, most of us, but how did you practice Sabbath with regard to connectivity and with the inability to kind of create private spaces?
I think most people knew that I did take Friday as a Sabbath day. And for the most part, I found they honored that and respected that, appreciated that I was trying to model, taking a day off for them. And that, I tried to say, again, what our theme is, Bill, hey, I got to fill my tank. I can't be there for you if I'm not taking good care of myself. And so, again, and we all know if we're in congregational ministry, that there's going to be the crises that happen on your day off, the illnesses, the deaths, the accidents. Most wedding rehearsals are Friday night. Most weddings are Saturday. And I did a lot of funerals and memorial services on Saturdays. And I found that, I had to find other days. I might go a couple of weeks and not get a Sabbath. And I try to squeeze in a couple of days to just say, hey, I need some time. So I think you have to be intentional, and you really do have to educate your laity to what life is like for a clergy person. They never saw me in the hospital room or in the hospice room on Christmas morning, literally about half of those 38 years. They didn't see me on Christmas afternoon away from my family writing the memorial or funeral service I do the next day. They don't see that, and they can't help that they don't see it. But in gentle ways, I think we have to educate them.
The whole notion of setting boundaries and honoring boundaries without being legalistic is a challenge, isn't it?
It is. It really is. But because if you're in congregational ministry, I think you're in it because you love your people. You want to be there for them. And when there's a crisis, you want to respond. But I have found that, if somebody emailed me on a Friday, hey, I need to see you, most of the time, 9 times out of 10, it could wait till Sunday afternoon after that last worship service. And hey, could we meet Sunday afternoon? Would that work for you? So I think that most people are willing to meet us more than halfway.
Urgent and important don't always go together. I mean, what seems to be urgent may not be important, and sometimes what's important may not appear to be urgent. So
absolutely.
So if you were giving guidance to young clergy entering the first stages of their ministry, what are some habits you would suggest early on that you didn't practice? You've alluded to them, of course. Yeah. But how would you do it differently?
Well, I'm an extrovert. So I love people, and the difference between an extrovert and an introvert is extroverts get their energy from being with people so they can go be by themselves, and introverts get their energy from being by themselves so they can go be with people.
Okay.
And, but as I've gotten older, I have discovered a deeper contemplative, introverted side of me. And I would invite young ministers, regardless of what their tendencies are, especially if they're extroverts, to give some introverted contemplative time, a chance. Go on retreat, practice that weekly Sabbath day. That's one of the things I've been talking to the Wake Forest Baptist Church staff coming out of COVID. There are a couple of seasoned ministers, couple of ministers that are a little younger, and they're all working hard, so dedicated. They've taken on a lot more now that a senior pastor has retired, and I've been talking with them about, hey, you take that time off each week, go to a retreat center, and know that I will bless you and cover for you. And I've actually, Bill, already gone to a couple of the lay leaders to share with them, to sensitize them about what I'm seeing, not just at Wake Forest or at Oakmont, but what I'm seeing across the board, what we're all seeing as we hear stories and read the literature. So I think that's what I'd say to these young ministers. You just make self-care physically, emotionally, and spiritually a big part of your life. And, I don't know about you, Bill. Well, no, I think I do know about you. We want these young ministers to be where we are at our age. We want to see them move towards a retirement or a semi-retirement, and to make it for the long haul. And if they don't take good care of themselves, they're not going to do it.
Right. And I do have a vested interest here. Greg is the interim at Wake Forest. My son, one of our 3 children, is the associate pastor there, and he's a young father with a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. Yep. So please help him with this, because his mom and dad worry about him over-functioning.
And all of those ministers are very talented on that staff, but Ryan Wilson certainly is an outstanding young man. You all need to know the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree.
Well,
that is true.
It grows more so. Well, thank you, Greg, for a reminder. This is the stuff they taught us, at least in theory, that most of us forgot. And like you said, my experience in my own life, and I'm looking at some of my friends on this call, that we're all kind of in the seasoned range of ministry, but we probably have all had a moment where we came up short. We were out of gas.
Yeah.
And there is a reason. The stats are pretty sobering. We have a 50% washout rate of clergy within the first 5 years of ministry. And when Lily studied that, much of it came out of a sense of fatigue and burnout. Often it was toxic culture of the congregation as well. And the other kind of haunting stat is that only 1 out of 10 seminary graduates retires from the ministry. So people like you and Guy and others on this call, Phil, we're the exceptions to this. And part of the sobering part of this is that like other professions, like other helping professions, which would be, docs, for example, similar stats, teachers, and much of it can be traced back to a lack of self-care. So let's hope and pray that we can help share that good word with others. Jeannie's going to say a word about our next guest, next week's webinar. Jeannie, fire away.
Thank you, Bill. Greg, this was so good. I have loved this series. I have a whole page of notes that I want to go back and ponder over. I am excited to let you know that next week, Reverend Jane Davis, who is Associate Pastor and Minister of Spiritual Formation at First Baptist Wilmington, will be sharing with us. I have worked with Jane for over 20 years, and she is deeply thoughtful and articulate, and her words always are a soothing balm to my soul, even in our friendship conversations. So I'm so looking forward to her sharing with us next week. She is going to be talking about the lessons that she gained this summer while on sabbatical, and just how we can practice those every day in our lives and in our ministry. And so it's going to be a great time.
I will take away one of the key things that Greg said. I don't know if y'all heard this. Maybe I was listening for it, but he talked about these getaways to play golf. As my line, Greg, was, this is recreation, not recreation. I'm going out here to save myself. But I love the notion of a 48-hour golf retreat as a spiritual endeavor. I think that works. So.
Hey, when I was at Pendle Hill, we did contemplative gardening. And that's what really got me to thinking about how everything we enjoy doing can be contemplative, in nature. It doesn't matter whether I catch a fish or if I shoot 110 in golf, I'm
that's right.
hanging out with that. Hey, one quick thing, Dale.
Good word.
One quick thing just to say, one of the great blessings of doing our 20 years of spirituality retreat was for 3 or 4 years to have the First Baptist Church of Wilmington join us. And Jane Davis and Matt Cook were part of that, and some of their other staff. And we just loved the connection that the kinship we felt with the First Baptist Church family. So I just wanted to say that and thank Jane for her willingness to partner with us on those retreats.
Thank you, Andy, for your comment. Love it. Very appropriate. Well, blessings to all of you. And there are a couple of references to articles and books here that I would commend to you on top of what you've heard in this event. So, Greg, thank you for your good words and your ministry and your model, and 38 years in the same direction. What a gift that's been to that congregation and to us.
Thank you, Bill.
Go have your mini sabbatical wherever you will this afternoon, and blessings along the way.
Thank you.
Take care.
Peace.
Bye-bye.